It was a Tuesday afternoon in August. The gates of Graceland were closed. The city of Memphis was sweltering under a late summer heat that made the air feel thick and heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the mansion, something was wrong, and the people who were there that day, the ones who saw what happened, who heard the sounds, who held his hand before the ambulance arrived, most of them have spent the last 47 years trying to decide how much of the truth the world deserves to know. Tonight we put the pieces together. Tonight we talk about what really happened on August 16th, 1977, and why the official story has never quite been the whole story. To understand the night Elvis died, you have to understand the days that led up to it, because August 16th didn't arrive out of nowhere. It was the last page of a chapter that had been writing itself for years. Elvis was scheduled to leave for a tour on August 17th. One day after he died, he was supposed to be on a plane, heading to Portland, Maine, to kick off yet another round of performances across America. The tickets were sold, the venues were booked, the band was ready. But those who were around Elvis in the days before his death describe a man who seemed, in some hard to articulate way, like he was already somewhere else. Not frantic, not dramatic, just quieter than usual, more inward, like a candle burning low and steady in a room where all the windows are closed. He had been to the dentist on August 15th, the afternoon before he died. His dentist, Dr. Lester Hoffman, later recalled that Elvis seemed tired, but was in reasonable spirits. He had some dental work done, routine enough, and went home to Graceland in the early evening. That night he was restless. He couldn't sleep, which was nothing new because Elvis almost never slept at normal hours. His entire existence had been lived on a kind of inverted schedule for decades, awake when the world was dark, sleeping when the sun climbed. But that night the restlessness had a different quality to it. Those who were in the house describe him as moving through the rooms like a man who couldn't quite find where he was supposed to be. He played racquetball in the early hours of the morning. The court at Graceland was lit up past midnight. He played with his cousin Billy Smith and Billy's wife Jo, people who had been part of his life since childhood, people who loved him not for the fame, but for the person underneath it. They played for a while, and then they sat and talked, the way people do when the night gets quiet and comfortable and there's no reason to hurry anywhere. And then Elvis went to the piano. What happened next is one of the most quietly devastating details of that entire night. Billy Smith remembered it clearly when he spoke about it years later. He said Elvis sat down at the piano in the dim light of Graceland and began to play gospel music. Hymns, old songs from the church in Tupelo where he had grown up, where his mother had taken him as a small boy, where the music had first reached inside him and never fully let go. He sang Unchained Melody. He played it slowly, tenderly, the way you play a song when you're not performing it for anyone, when you're playing it for yourself, or for someone you've lost, or for some version of your life that exists only in memory now. Billy said he watched Elvis play and felt something he couldn't name. Not worry exactly, not alarm. Something more like witnessing, like watching a person be completely and utterly themselves for one unguarded moment. And then Elvis stopped. He stood up from the piano. He told Billy and Joe he was going upstairs to sleep before the tour. He said goodnight. He went up the stairs. That was the last time anyone who loved him saw him standing. The official timeline puts his death at sometime between early morning and early afternoon on August 16th. His girlfriend at the time, Ginger Alden, was asleep in the bedroom. Elvis, who often couldn't sleep in a traditional bed, had gone into the adjoining bathroom, something he did regularly in those years, sometimes reading for hours in there alone. He had told Ginger earlier that night that he was going to go read. He said, "Don't worry if I'm not in bed when you wake up." She didn't worry. Why would she? It was normal. It was just Elvis being Elvis, doing what he always did in the night hours, disappearing into his own private world for a while. Except this time, he didn't come back. Ginger Alden woke at around 2:30 in the afternoon. She noticed Elvis wasn't in bed. She called out for him. No answer. She walked to the bathroom door and knocked. Silence. She opened the door. What she found on the floor of that bathroom, what she saw in that moment, is something she has described in careful, measured words over the decades since. Elvis was on the floor, face down, unresponsive. He had collapsed. There was no way to know yet how long he had been there. She called downstairs immediately. Al Strada, a member of Elvis's staff, came up. Then Joe Esposito, his road manager, one of the men who had been with him for years, who had traveled the world with him, who knew his face as well as his own. Joe took one look and called for an ambulance. He began CPR. He kept going, kept working, kept refusing to accept what every instinct was probably already telling him. The paramedics arrived at Graceland at approximately 2:33 in the afternoon. They worked on Elvis in that bathroom. They transferred him to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. They kept trying all the way there. At 3:30 in the afternoon on August 16th, 1977, Dr. George Nicopolis, Elvis's personal physician, the same Dr. Nick whose prescriptions would later become the subject of criminal investigation, announced that Elvis Presley was dead. He was 42 years old. The official cause listed on the death certificate was cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat. The heart simply stopped. But from the very first hours after the announcement, something felt incomplete about that explanation. Not conspiratorial, nothing as dramatic as that, just incomplete. Like a sentence that ends in the middle of a thought. Because the question nobody wanted to ask out loud was already forming in the minds of everyone who knew anything about how Elvis had been living. The heart stops for reasons, and those reasons matter. The autopsy on Elvis Presley was performed by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the Shelby County medical examiner. The results were officially declared inconclusive in terms of the role of drugs, a finding that bewildered medical professionals around the country who reviewed the case later. What was not disclosed publicly at the time, what was quietly kept within the walls of the medical and legal establishment in Memphis, was the toxicology report, the full one, not the summary, the actual findings. When that report was eventually made available and reviewed by independent medical experts in the years and decades following Elvis's death, what they found was significant. There were 14 different drugs present in Elvis Presley's system at the time of his death, some at therapeutic levels, some well beyond that. A cocktail of sedatives and codeine-based painkillers and other prescription medications that, in combination, placed enormous strain on the cardiovascular system. Dr. Francisco maintained his position for years, that drugs did not cause Elvis's death, that the cardiac event was the result of a long-standing heart condition, and the heart condition was real. Elvis's heart had been enlarged for some time. There was genuine, documented physical illness at work, but the medical community was deeply divided. Several cardiologists and forensic experts who examined the evidence in subsequent years concluded that the combination of medications in Elvis's system on that day almost certainly contributed to, and may have directly caused, the cardiac event that killed him. The truth, as is so often the case, was not a single clean line. It was a tangle, a convergence of things, the decades of physical strain, the genuine illness, the medications, the exhaustion, the grief that had never properly healed. All of it arriving at the same door on the same August afternoon. But there was one more layer. One more detail that rarely gets mentioned in the standard telling of this story. Elvis had been told, not by Dr. Nick, by others, by people who cared enough to speak the hard words. There had been conversations, real ones, uncomfortable ones, in the months before August. People who had tried to reach him. A physician outside his usual circle who had, on at least one occasion, laid out in plain language what the medications were doing to his body and what the likely outcome would be if things continued unchanged. Elvis had listened. He had nodded. He had been, by all accounts, genuinely moved by the concern. And then he had gone back to Graceland, and the tour had been scheduled, and the machinery had kept turning. Because stopping was the one thing nobody, not Elvis, not the people around him, had ever truly learned how to do. The news broke on the radio and television at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on August 16th. And what happened next was something that the people who lived through it have never been able to fully describe to anyone who wasn't there. America stopped. Not in a metaphorical way. People pulled their cars over on highways when they heard the announcement on the radio because they couldn't drive anymore. Employees in offices sat down at their desks and didn't move. Strangers on streets in cities across the country looked at each other with the stunned expression of people who have just learned that something permanent has shifted in the world. The phones at radio stations jammed within minutes. Letters and flowers began arriving at Graceland so quickly that the staff couldn't process them. Crowds gathered at the gates. Not the usual fan gatherings. Not the excited clusters of admirers hoping for a glimpse of the man inside. These were people in genuine grief, crying openly, holding each other, placing their hands against the stone walls as if proximity to the place could close some of the distance. 75,000 people came to Memphis in the days following his death. For the public viewing at Graceland, the line stretched for miles in the August heat. People waited for hours. They came from every state. Old women who had screamed at his concerts in 1956. Young people who had grown up with his records in their parents' living rooms. Veterans who remembered him from when he was drafted. Families who had driven through the night because they didn't know what else to do with the feeling. In the Oval Office, President Jimmy Carter released a statement. He called Elvis a symbol of the vitality, rebelliousness, and good humor of his country. He said the music would live forever. He was right about that, at least about that. At Graceland, in a room upstairs, Lisa Marie Presley was 9 years old. Her father had been supposed to pick her up. They had plans. She had been looking forward to seeing him. When the adults in the house tried to explain what had happened, she is reported to have said, in the way that children sometimes cut through the entire weight of adult grief with a single sentence, that she wanted to wait for her daddy to come back. She was 9 years old, and she waited. Elvis Aaron Presley was buried on August 18th, 1977, first at Forest Hill Cemetery, alongside his mother Gladys. Later, both were moved to the Meditation Garden at Graceland, because the crowds at the cemetery had become unmanageable. Too many people, too much love, too much grief, too much of everything for one burial ground to hold. He's still there now, in that garden, right behind the house where he was happiest and saddest and most himself. The questions about that night have never fully gone away. They have softened with time, but they haven't disappeared. Every few years, a new investigation or documentary or biography reopens the files and looks at the evidence again. And every time, the conclusion is roughly the same. A man failed by the systems built around him, failed by the people who loved him without knowing how to help him, failed in the end by his own body, which had simply been given too much to carry for too long. But here is what gets lost in all those investigations, all those findings, all those careful clinical conclusions. He was extraordinary, not just talented, not just famous, Genuinely, bewilderingly, once in a generation extraordinary. A boy from a shotgun house in Mississippi who had no business sounding like that, moving like that, reaching people like that. And yet he did. He walked into a recording studio in Memphis in 1954, and he opened his mouth and something came out that had never existed before and has never quite been replicated since. He gave everything he had. Every night on every stage in every city for 22 years, he gave everything. He gave until there was nothing left to give. And the world took it and asked for more. And he kept saying yes because saying no meant silence. And silence meant being alone with himself. And being alone with himself was the one thing Elvis Presley could never quite survive. What really happened the night Elvis died is this. A man who had been slowly disappearing for years finally ran out of road. A body that had been pushed past its limits finally said enough. A heart that had been broken and mended and broken again since the morning his twin brother was buried in a shoebox finally went quiet. And a 9-year-old girl sat in a room at Graceland and waited for her daddy to come back. He didn't, but the music did. The music always did. And 47 years later, somewhere in America, right now, someone is hearing Elvis Presley's voice for the very first time and feeling something shift inside their chest that they don't quite have words for yet. That's not legacy. That's not fame. That's something rarer than both. That's what it sounds like when a soul refuses to be gone. If this story moved you, share it with someone who remembers exactly where they were when they heard the news. Subscribe for more stories told the way they deserve to be told.